Hi, I'm Bruce Baker, and this is another lecture in my History of New Orleans series. This is a quick introduction to New Orleans geography. Now, I'll start with a disclaimer. I'm not a geographer. These are some key things that I think are useful if you're going to study the history of New Orleans, and it's good just to get a basic grounding in the geography. However, the real geographer you should be reading is Professor Richard Campanella of Tulane University. Buy and read the many books that he's written and the even larger number of articles that he's published in a variety of venues, including the New Orleans Times-Picayune and other things. And a lot of those articles are available on his website, which is very interesting and well worth a look. So with respect to Professor Campanella and other actual geographers, here's my list of the 10 things that I think are useful to know about the geography of the city of New Orleans if you're going to understand the history of it. And number 1 is the Pine Island Trend. You probably expected me to say the Mississippi River, but I'm going to put that as number 2. So for a long time, as we're probably aware, and if I were a river scientist, a sort of physical geographer, I could talk about why this is, but I'm not. But the Mississippi River moved around a lot in its channel moves as it sort of moves through the delta and so on over a period of several thousand years. But then about 4,500 years ago, the Pearl River, which is this one highlighted here, which is a little ways to the east of New Orleans where it empties into the Gulf, and it's the river that provides the border between Louisiana's Florida parishes and the state of Mississippi. So the Pearl River, emptying into the Gulf of Mexico, dumped loads of sand, which then turned into a barrier island in the Gulf, and the currents of the Gulf slowly pushed that barrier island, which we know as Pine Island, pushed it to the west until it winds up in the position where it is now. Now, what this means is that once Pine Island was in its current location, and eventually it becomes covered over with subsequent layers of soil, so it's not something that you can see on the surface except for a tiny area there which is circled in red. But once Pine Island is there, it more or less stops the Mississippi River from moving any further north than that. And to some extent, it's part of why the levee that's formed at the edge of the Mississippi River on which the city of New Orleans is built, it's part of why that winds up being quite where it is. The other thing that it does is that it blocks Lake Pontchartrain, which had been a bay off of the Gulf of Mexico. You can see how it sort of cuts that off and turns it into a large brackish water lake rather than proper seawater. So number 2 thing to know about geography is in fact the Mississippi River. And the first thing to remember is that the Mississippi River drains a huge area in the middle of the United States, extending up to and ever so slightly beyond the Canadian border, up almost to the edge of the Great Lakes, from the Appalachian Mountains in the east to the Rocky Mountains in the west. It is by a considerable distance the most important river system in North America. The other thing, on a much more local level, is that you want to at least sort of be familiar with the general shape of the river around the city of New Orleans, that distinctive crescent that gives the city the nickname of the Crescent City. Downstream from the city in the area, if I can find my cursor, in this area is the English Turn. And the other thing to remember about the river, I suppose, is that it is this natural levee that forms over a long period of time when it floods that creates the high ground for the French Quarter and the front part of the city. And the topography of the city, the elevation, basically slopes away in the back headed towards Lake Pontchartrain. So the farther you get from the Mississippi River, the more swampy and overgrown and unsuitable for building on the land is, at least until it's drained. Lake Pontchartrain, and it's worth going to the effort of learning to spell that, I think, is at the backside of the city. There's a smaller lake to the west called Lake Maurepas, and to the east is Lake Bourne, which is essentially a little branch of the Gulf of Mexico. One of the things that makes Lake Pontchartrain important, aside from it's just a sort of body of water at the backside of the city, is that it provided, in the earliest days of French settlement, a convenient sort of back door to the Gulf of Mexico that avoided having to go down the 100 miles of the Mississippi River and navigate through the rather confusing outlets of the passes that lead it from the end of the river into the Gulf. So it was possible to take Bayou St. John, which goes from more or less the back end of the French Quarter, a little bit beyond that, right out to Lake Pontchartrain, and then find a water route out to the Gulf of Mexico and cut off that long journey down the river. Number 4 is the French Quarter, the most famous part of the city of New Orleans, the oldest, laid out by the French royal engineer Adrien de Pouget in 1721, sometimes called the Vieux Carré. And this is bounded by the river at the front and Rampart Street at the back, and extends from Esplanade Avenue downstream to Canal Street upstream. The other thing I would say to just be aware of, there are many, many features we could dwell on in the French Quarter, but be aware of Jackson Square, which is a sort of central public space and used for all sorts of things over the years. The 5th thing is we're going to go back to a sort of geological feature, and that is the Metairie-Gentilly Ridge. So about 2,600 years ago, if we remember, the Pine Island trend has sort of locked the Mississippi River more or less in its place, so it's not going to go too awfully high beyond or too awfully far north of where it is, but it does continue to move a little bit within that boundary. And about 2,600 years ago, it was more or less parallel to where it is now, except a bit further north. Later, this changes as the river follows what's now its main channel, and this becomes a sort of distributary bayou that is eventually filled in. But the natural levees that are created along this remain, and we can sort of see them here in this 1849 map. So this is a map created at the time of a flood in 1849 that originated from a levee break here. And this dark area is the area of the city that flooded. So we can see that the natural levee, the high ground alongside the Mississippi River, doesn't flood, but it floods all the way back until it gets to the Metairie-Gentilly Ridge, and that higher ground, which isn't much higher, it's about 7 feet higher than the surrounding area, but that's enough to sort of stop the flooding here. So it's just worth bearing in mind that that is a bit of higher ground, and in the early days at least, higher ground is better ground. So the Metairie-Gentilly Ridge is the 6th thing that we're going to look at. The 5th thing. The 6th thing is the West Bank. And this is, I like to think of this as a very sort of classic New Orleans sort of thing. If you stand at the foot of Canal Street next to the river and look to the east across the Mississippi River, looking to the east, you're looking at the West Bank. This seems counterintuitive, but it's because the Mississippi River divides the United States roughly into an east half and a west half. And the West Bank is actually the western side of the Mississippi River, but the various twists and turns that the river takes means that it's flowing more or less north at that point. So to see the west side, you have to look to the east. Think about it, and it will make sense. Some of the communities on the West Bank include Algiers and Gretna and Westwego and to some extent, especially in the early 20th century, there's growing port facilities at some of these, as some of the capacity for the needs of the port sort of expand the existing capacity. Now, there are a number of important streets in New Orleans. We're never going to know all of the streets and roads in the city, but I think it's useful to know at least a handful of the key ones, and it's useful to sort of think of them as ones that go parallel to the river, and this includes sort of curves that follow the curve of the river to some extent, and ones that go perpendicular. So if we start with streets that are parallel to the river and moving in from the river back, we start with Tchoupitoulas Street, and if you learn how to spell that, then, well, you don't know everything about New Orleans history, but once again, it's, sort of sets you apart from the common herd. Moving back, we get to Magazine Street. Next is St. Charles Avenue, famous with the streetcar. And finally, Claiborne Avenue. And for whatever reasons, when I was pulling these maps off of Google Maps, I couldn't get it to show all of Claiborne Avenue at one time, so I have it sort of in two pieces here. If we look at key streets running perpendicular to the river, it's worth bearing in mind that some of these are streets that were divisions between different wards of the city now, and also in fact between the different municipalities at the time when the city was divided into different municipalities and before it annexes or sort of absorbs Lafayette and Jefferson City. But I won't go into the details of those, but just bear in mind that the way the city is divided, these perpendicular streets divided into different pieces, and this is not unlike the way that the French laid out plantations with a little front along the river and sort of stretching back away from the river. But if we start from downstream and sort of work our way upstream, we have Elysian Fields Avenue, Esplanade Avenue, and now the sort of biggest and most important street in New Orleans, which is Canal Street. And this, of course, is one boundary of the French Quarter, and after the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, for quite a considerable time, it divides the French Quarter from what becomes known as the American section of the city on the other side. Moving along, there's Julius Street, Louisiana Avenue, Napoleon Avenue, Jefferson Avenue, and Carrollton Avenue. There are a number of lots and lots of different neighborhoods and sections of the city. We won't get into all of those, but I think this particular map does a really good job of sort of putting those in a sort of visual, easy to identify sort of way. So we'll have a look at those. Some areas, obviously, we've heard of the lower Ninth Ward and the upper Ninth Ward. Much of the rest of the city doesn't tend to use the ward names, although they're still important. The Arts District here is, on this map, is roughly what used to be known as the Warehouse District, back when warehouses were a bit more important to the economy of the city than the arts. And the last thing, number 10, that I want to mention is the sort of expansion of the city away from the Mississippi River in the direction of Lake Pontchartrain, which happens in the decades on either side of 1900. We can see this most clearly in a pair of maps. And the map on the left is from the 1870s. The map on the right is from 1819. You can see, as you look at the map on the left, that all of this is still forested and swamp and not drained. And in fact, a chunk right here in the middle. And if we remember back to the Metairie-Gentilly Ridge, this is part of the area that's still sort of low-lying. So in the 1870s, there are substantial parts of the city, as the city as we know it now, which are still not developed. And this is because the land is too low and swampy to be built upon. But once the city begins to drain that, it makes the land available to build on. It causes other problems like the land settling. But by World War I, by about the end of the 1910s, most of this area here is all filled in with sort of new residential and business areas and new streets and so forth. So that's really the last sort of what I think of as a key bit of geography to know about the city. We could continue to study lots and lots of geography, but hopefully this will be enough to at least provide a baseline for understanding some of the key things in the history of the city, at least as it's being presented in this series of lectures. As always, I want to give credit where credit is due for the images, and if there are any copyright issues, please get in touch with me and I will make amends and fix things and re-record this if necessary, but hopefully we haven't caused any problems here. So, I hope you enjoyed that.